Hey, it's Broken Office Chair, a podcast produced by Alternatives. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director Bessie Alcantara. Bessie is a Chicago native, first-generation Salvadoran Mexican-American who's passionate about dismantling systemic racism. In each episode, Bessie will be joined by her friends and colleagues who are ready to speak candidly about their experiences as people of color in their various professions. In the episodes, they'll address topics such as issues in the nonprofit sector, racial equity, DEI in practice, and much, much more. So stay tuned.
If you're enjoying this episode, we have a few upcoming events that will be perfect for you. Join Alternatives and Broken Office Chair on October 5th at Chicago United for Equity for our second Cocktails and Complicity event. Guest speakers Ayoka Samuels and Leslie Honore from Broken Office Chair Season 1 will join Bessie in discussing the complex dynamics that perpetuate inequality in the nonprofit sector, such as being a woman of color in nonprofit leadership, the nonprofit industrial complex, the intersection of capitalism and philanthropy, and much more. Come enjoy a cocktail, network with nonprofit friends, and engage in these much-needed conversations. The link to RSVP will be in the show's notes. Have you been personally impacted by a toxic nonprofit? Do you have a nonprofit horror story that you're dying to share? We're right here with you. Join Alternatives for an in-person open mic night where nonprofit friends can gather and share horror stories about navigating the nonprofit industrial complex. Come prepared with your favorite story, poem, or song about the terrors of funder site visits, annual appeals, audits, and more. We invite you to share a drink with colleagues and revel in the joys of nonprofit life. The link to RSVP will be in the show notes.
All right, so today I am joined by Ángela Munguía, Executive Director of AMP. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So to kick it off, you have, as we talked about, a very interesting perspective as a founding ED.
Yeah.
Tell us how you got into that line of work.
Yeah. So I've been doing nonprofit work for, I used to say, until like a couple of months ago, I used to say 15 years, but then I realized that I've been saying that for 5 years past the 15-year mark. And I'm like, oh my God, it's been like 20 years, right? So I've been in the nonprofit field for like 20 years, started as like even like a teenager, right? And I've worked at organizations that are like super small, volunteer-led, right, grassroots, to like national large organizations. And so I guess like how I ended up at AMPT, right, is that over the years and in different roles, I've just kind of accumulated like as an employee, like what are the things that work, what are the things that don't work? And I felt like what was steady across my experience was that smaller, large organization, like when it comes down to like building internal capacity, like no one does it. Mm-hmm. Or there's not like a huge emphasis or priority on it, right? It's just like we always like make sure, and obviously when I say always, I'm making a generalization, not everybody does this. But like in my experience, it was like, oh, we are really hyper focused on building like the strongest of the strongest program. Whatever the program is, whether it's like an organizing thing, whether it's youth development work, my background is primarily in youth development. And so a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of staff, a lot of capacity, a lot of dollars into building out strong programming. But then when it's about like building staff capacity at large or like professional development or like, you know, does the admin team have 3 people and programming is 25 people? Like to me, I started to notice that regardless of the size of the organization, like capacity building and like building internal structure and system was always a thing that like got left behind in the name of building out this external facing, you know, product ultimately. So when AMPT, you know, put out this job, or Point the Way, put out the job description, a friend of mine sent it and was like, I think you should do this. And I had done a previous like founding ED situation at a national organization. It did not work out. Not my fault, right? The whole organization kind of like collapsed. And I felt really like traumatized by that experience. It was my first time and I was like, okay, I think I think I have the expertise. I think I have the experience.
I
to be
told
able
you
to do
I'm
this.
still scared of
Oh,
a founding
yeah.
ED position, and
Yeah.
I've done ED positions before.
Yeah, exactly. And so because it's like it's a lot
Yeah.
of work, and so I like mustered up the courage to be able to do it, and then the whole thing fell apart, right? And so it took me a little bit of time. I took like 6 months off, and I was just like, I'm just gonna hang out at home. I'm gonna go to the beach. I'm gonna read. I'm gonna cry. I'm gonna do all the things, right? So by the time this new opportunity came around, I was like, okay, like I read through it. I ultimately what came back to me was like all the things I just shared, right? And it was just like, yeah, like when it comes to capacity building, there isn't a lot available for organizations. And on top of that, when you bring it down even further and you're talking specifically about organizations that are led by people of color, it's even less so, right? And I just felt very compelled. I was like, yeah, I think I could do this. And I feel very strongly about it, like given kind of my experience along the way. So I was like, all right, let's do it. And it's been fantastic. I mean, it is hard. And I was thinking last night about our conversation about the founding ED versus like the established organization. And what I came to, right, was that as a founding ED, I think there's a level of flexibility and creativity that you have to like make it your own, right? It's just like coming in, AMPT was an idea. It was an assortment of really good researched ideas, right? Like there were definitely suggestions and recommendations that came from the nonprofit sector about like what this organization should look like. But ultimately, like you got to figure everything out, right? As an ED, like you got to figure out like your staffing, what the program is going to actually look like, how many people is it going to serve? Are you going to do grants? Who's going to administer those grants? What are the policies that you have to put into place? There's just so many things. And I think for me, I found excitement in the possibility of doing that because I remember being like, well, there are policies that as an employee, I was like, really like, yeah, that's awesome. And then there were a lot of them, probably most of them, that I was like, this is terrible. Like, this is not a human-centered approach, right? And to me, it was like, this is an opportunity for me to bring in not only my like expertise, but also like this idea of a human-centered approach to nonprofit work that I just hadn't seen done in the way that I knew like I could try to figure out.
So it's funny because I told you that like alternatives was a bit like of a turnaround situation when I came on board. And so one of the a couple of things that happened was we were going through a strategic planning process. So we actually ended up cutting one of our programs because we decided we were not good at it. And we went in a direction that was not my initial instinct. But another thing that happened was I had almost complete turnover of my staff. I think that 3 people out of like a 20-person leadership team was left afterwards. And for me, I was like, okay, cool. Like everybody was like, you're not freaking out. I was like, no, this is opportunity because that's when I restructured and moved things around and stuff like that. But kind of what I said to you, I still felt like I had the safety of a 50-year reputation and something that already like, because we kept our behavioral health programs and our RJ programs. So I was like, okay, I have something to hold on to as opposed to creating something. And a lot of our programming today are new things that folks came up with along the way, but we still had a foundation. And I think that's why I'm so scared of the founding ED position, because you're building your foundation as opposed to like building upon something that somebody already set up for you.
Yeah. Well, what I will say about AMP that's a little bit different, right? Because I didn't just it wasn't my idea, right? So let's start there. AMPT was not my idea. So like it started from research that was done, put together by a handful of funders, right? Who got together, wanted to understand what does capacity building look like for the South and the West Side specifically. I think where the opportunity came from me is that, I was interviewing for the role at the start of the pandemic. So, I applied for the role, had gotten through most of the interviews, and then all of a sudden it was like, we're on lockdown. And so my final interview was actually like at the beginning of March, right? So it was like, everything is like on fire, And what I don't know why I did this. I'm just going to be honest. I don't know why I did this. I wish I had some eloquent answer for why I did this. And maybe it's just a personality thing, right? But I remember being in my final interview with some of the board members, and I started crying. And I was like, I don't cry. Like, this is not the thing that I do. I sure as hell don't cry at interviews or in, like, public spaces, right? I barely cry in my personal life. Shout out to my therapist. But I started crying in my interview, and I was like, listen, like, there is an opportunity here to, like, do something big. Like, the world is on fire. You know, like, people are up in arms. Like, there are people of color who are being killed. Like, this is real, right? This is real. Like, this is not a job for me. Like, this is my reality. Like, I have a son. Like, this is real, right? And I said to them, like, if you want to give me this job, I am committed to doing this only if we put race at the forefront. Mm-hmm. It has to be an anti-racist framing, because if it doesn't, it's just another capacity building program. It's just another capacity building idea. You know, capacity building exists. It's there. There are plenty of organizations who do it, right? But, like, what's the difference here? And if we're focusing on, you know, this research that outlined that this, you know, this enfranchisement of communities of color and, like, talking about inequities here, like, we have to do right by that. We can't leave that out of the conversation. And so, like, if you want me to do this job, like, here's me saying this at my final interview. I don't have a job, right? so like, I kind of need this, right? But if you want me to do this, like, I have to do it in this way. And they were like, all right. And they thanked me for my time. And I hung up, you know, my little Zoom call. And I was like, fuck, I'm not going to get this job. I was like, all right, well, we're on lockdown. I got savings. Let me go tell my partner that I just, like, completely screwed this one up, right? I got emotional during my meeting. And then they called me and they were like, yeah, it's you. And so to me, I was just like, all right, well, I put my cards on the table, right? I said, like, if you want me to do this, like, I'm coming in here and I'm disrupting. I'm disrupting this idea that funders had, and I'm going to do it my way, and I'm going to do it in collaboration with other communities of color, and I'm going to do it with us at the forefront as people of color, right? I'm going to do it with the idea that my accountability is not to funders. My accountability is to people who look like me, who live in my community, who do the work the way that I do. You know, like, that's my accountability. And I say that still to my board. I'm just like, I'm not accountable to XYZ Foundation. I'm accountable to these folks because those are my colleagues. Those are my people, right? And I think that that's really, like, for me, had I come into something that was established, it would be a little bit harder to do that. I mean, you have, right? And so, like, I'm like, I have the utmost respect for you being able to do that, because shifting people, change management is hard.
But I think what's interesting about my story, and I think there's overlap in yours, is the board buy-in. Because the board decided, right, that's our boss, right? And I'm putting quotation marks in it.
Yeah, boss.
Our boss, right? My board always argues that they're more of a partner, but ultimately they could hire and fire the ED, right? Yeah. And so one of the moments for me, and I came into alternatives, I was interviewing the summer of 2018. And so I feel like when the pandemic happened, a shift happened in what funders were able to listen to, that they were not willing to listen to a few years before that, right? And so a defining moment, I was not interested in this job initially because I was like, another youth development job. Like, it's not even why I went into social work. I just kind of fell into it.
You're a social worker.
I'm a social worker by training, right? And so I went into social work because I wanted to do, like, the hard stuff, like, whatever that means.
Joke's on you.
And I was like, youth development feels good to folks. And I came from organizations that really played up how youth development feels good. Yeah. And so it didn't feel like the quote unquote hard stuff to me. Although in Chicago, I can realize how untrue of a statement that really is now. But I was doing a phone screening and I was actually traveling. So I've never taken time off in my life. I went straight to college. I worked through college, etc. And so I had decided to take this year off and travel the world. And so I started July 2017 and I ended September 2018. So in that time, I did a phone interview with alternatives and they knew this is what I was doing. And so I took the call from London. And I remember not really preparing for it and just like jumping on it. I was at a friend's house. And at the end, I asked something along the lines of, I can't remember the exact question, but like something around like, are agency operations working the way that you would like to see them? Or is the agency where you would like to see it at? And one of my board members who's on the call jumped in, an older white man, I love him to death, and was like, no, we have too many white people. Like literally that's what he opened up with and went into like really passionately about like the community and how we have to represent the community that we served and how that's a priority for the organization. And I think that gave me enough interest because I had never heard a board acknowledge that before. And so I was like, they're willing to have a conversation that I haven't had before. And I was like, I think that's important. And so, like, I came on board, and there were larger issues than just diversity, but it was, one of the things, for example, that I found is that there was a huge discrepancy between what white folks were paid and what Black and brown folks were paid. But it had to do a lot with, like, credentials and who was in leadership positions, because it was a white executive team. And so those positions are going to skew higher. Yeah. And then who was credentialed and who wasn't. Because all of my therapists, which tend to be higher paid positions, were white. And so, like, these different things started happening, and I was talking to my board about it, and they were very openly having the conversation. And so when everything basically shit hit the fan, like, I didn't expect everybody to just leave. Yeah. One of the things that kept me there was how willing the board was to have these difficult conversations. Yeah. And so we're such a different organization today than what we were in 2018, because the board, the executive team, the program staff, our funders, our partners, everybody was so willing to have a different conversation that, like, a lot of what we do is training on anti-racism and talking to folks about that. And I'm doing at the social work conference, NASW, later on this fall, we're doing a workshop on workplace wellness, anti-racism as workplace wellness. And so, like, yes, we were able to pivot it, but it all the right ingredients needed to be there at the right time. I also joke about the fact that I showed up 10 minutes late to my interview and they still took me after that. So I think they knew what they were getting. And I talked about work-life balance and how important it was for me to be able to travel and all these different things. And at the time, I didn't connect it to burnout in the same way I would connect it to today. But, like, they were willing to accommodate all these things that up until that point I'd been taught were wrong to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's why I went so hard in my interview, quite honestly, because I was just like, okay, like, am I going to just fall in line with, like, all the things that I've been taught, and maybe not, like, directly taught, right, but indirectly taught about, like, what it means to, like, be a leader at an organization, right? Like, what does it mean to lead the organization, to make decisions? How do you show up? What do you look like? How do you talk? What do you dress like? Like, all the things, right? And, you know, I think I put my cards on the table with the board, like, one, because, you know, I got into the interview and I was just like, are we not going to talk about what's happening right now?
Right.
Like, this is, like, what? You know? And so I felt like I just couldn't, I couldn't hold it in, you know? And also, like, I'm the oldest child, right? So I talk to myself quite frequently. And so I was, like, having a conversation with myself ahead of time anyway. And I was just like, you know, I've made a commitment to myself that any role that I take, be it AMPT or any role that comes after the fact, like, I have to be my authentic self, and I have to have integrity for myself, and I'm not going to mold myself to be someone different to fit there. The role that is right for me is going to be where I can show up as me, and I made that commitment when I decided to interview for AMPT, right? And every day I make that commitment to myself, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, because sometimes it's a lot easier to be like, well, I'm DED, so I said, right?
Or,
and sometimes you want to do that, right? And sometimes it's just like, because, you know?
No, my team would not tolerate
no,
just
my
because.
My team would absolutely not tolerate that either. But it's just like, you know, it's work.
Yeah, it's work.
It's work to do different.
And also, and we talked a little bit about this, right? Like, the showing up work casually, the knowing that you may have to work a little harder to prove yourself if you don't play the game initially. Yeah. And even with my board, I made it a point to, like, make sure my tattoos were showing. I had to wear the same dress through all my interviews because I had gained weight and I was not buying new clothes. I had $28 in my bank account when I came back. So, like,
you wore the same dress to all your interviews?
All my interviews. And then you know what the worst part was? It was blue and white striped. So, like, it was not even, like, a black dress that I could pretend was a different one. I was like, yo, I'm broke. Like, I just went traveling for a year. Yeah. Like, that's the biggest indulgence I'd never even dreamed of in my life. Yeah. And so, no, I fully showed up like, you gonna know who I cursed through my interviews. I was like, you're just gonna know who I am. Fuck it.
Yeah. Yeah, same.
I try to talk to folks, though, a little bit about the fact that if you choose to do that, like, everybody has that choice to make, right? If you choose to do that, your job will be harder.
Yeah.
You may not get that $200,000 if you're an ED. You may not get that $200,000 a year job, or even if you're on the front lines, you may not get that $60,000, $70,000 job because people are expecting you to play a specific part when you represent them.
Yep.
And so, like, what are you willing to compromise if your thing is authenticity?
Yeah, I agree. So I don't have a college degree, right? And I'm very honest about that. You know, when I take roles, because I really believe, I'm just like, I learned how to do my job like on the job. You know, I've been doing this work for a really long time, and so like, you're not going to tell me that because I have this credential that that's any more valid than the fact that I've been doing this for like, at this stage, 20 years, right? But when and so my background, like I said, is in youth development. So I've also been very honest with young people about that. Like, I don't have a degree, right? However, what I say to them is like, I'm not saying that you need to take my route. It was a lot harder for me, right? Like, there are privileges that I was able to lean on. You know, like, I'm well spoken. You know, like, I have a pretty good vocabulary. Like, I have charisma, right? Like, I know what I'm talking about in certain cases. And so, like, I have light skin privilege, right? I was born here. You know, I am a small woman that's like, you know, like, I am like aesthetically pleasing to some extent, right? Like, there are all are things that, like, I'm just like, these are privileges. These are privileges that I have, right, over other folks. I'm cisgendered, right? Like, I have 2 children, right? I live a pretty normal life, right? And so it's easier in some cases for me. And it was also really hard because I'm a brown woman. You know, I'm a brown woman. I have tattoos. I have piercings, you know, like, I don't have a degree. And so I am honest about the fact that, like, I worked my ass off. And it took me longer to get to where I'm at than I probably would have if I had a degree.
Right.
I had probably done jobs that I got paid so much less money for than some of my counterparts who had less experience, but they had a degree, right? And it is about, to me, ultimately, is like, you have to choose your own adventure, but you have to be really honest about what you're willing to give and what you're willing to take.
I just want to plug alternatives for a sec because, you know, we only pay $1,000 difference for a degree
Do you?
versus not. Yeah. So we actually, this is constantly a controversial topic. Our entry level salary is $51K. If you have a master's degree and are a therapist, you're at $52K. And so you can have a high school diploma at 51 or you can have an MSW at 52.
Yeah.
And because our goal is not market value, our goal is making sure everybody gets paid a thrivable wage.
Yeah.
And what folks don't think about when they're one of the things I read really early on was around how there is this removal of degree requirements, but folks are not paying people. They removed the degree, but they also lowered the salary because they're like, you don't have this credential. And that doesn't allow Black and brown people to build wealth because you still don't have extra money because you may have access to the job, but the pay is so low, right? And so we made a really conscious effort to not punish people. We're like, the skills that we require are still the same. The job you're doing is still the same.
Yeah.
So why would we punish you for not having the degree? Yeah. And then we do offer student loan repayment for the folks that do have a degree. So, like, that's cool. Kind of, we're able to do that, right? Because we're larger. But that was one of the things because I was just joking about this. So one of my folks is also an MSW, and we were trying to hire into a position yesterday, and we were reading our child welfare license. Again, we read it every single time. And because we were trying to make the MSW requirement disappear every time we reread it, because we know who we want we were trying to figure out who we want for the position and what we were posting for. And it was really funny because the reason we're required this license is because we have to place young people who are in crisis in temporary shelter and with the goal of permanent housing. Okay. And I'm like, we both went to social work school. It's not like they teach you how to do that in class. Like, what is the whole point of having this degree?
Yeah, right? Yeah, I mean, had I finished my degree, right, because I went to college, I just didn't finish. Had I followed through, I would have graduated with, like, a degree in cultural anthropology and, like, creative writing. What part of that degree would have helped me in my job right now, except maybe having some historical knowledge about, like, people? You know, like, nothing at all. Like, a lot of the stuff that I've had to learn has been, like, on the job, right? Like, it's just like, you know, you become an ED and it's like, be good at everything.
Right.
Like, be an accountant and be, like, an HR manager and be, like, you know, do all these things. I I would have not. Like,
They don't teach you that in school.
They don't teach you any of that stuff in school.
They don't
right?
even really teach you how to manage folks in school, which is like the largest part of my job.
Yeah, it's the hardest part.
Mm-hmm.
It's the hardest part.
Yeah. And then on top of it, when I graduated from grad school, I always talk about this. I like graduated with $75,000 in student loans. And then
That's like a salary.
yes. But I was earning my first job, I was earning, I think, $50K, which is a good salary as a director. This is more than 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
But it wasn't enough to keep up with my payments. Like, and so I'm like putting the stuff in forbearance. And so when the pandemic started and our interest was frozen, I owed $115,000. So I was one of the folks that was forgiven under the PSLF waiver.
Yeah.
But the fact that I had 10 years of payment, right? That's how I got forgiven. 10 years of payment, and I owed more than what I started with.
Yeah.
And so I always talk about, like, again, yes, it will be harder. And also, it was easier for me to move up, but I never made enough to pay off my student loans, right? But then again, my position is also MSW required. So I wouldn't even have this position if I didn't have the degree.
Really?
Yeah, because of the child welfare license.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so, like, there's so much to consider. I went back to school because I started realizing that so many of the positions I wanted were MSW required. And so that was a very conscious effort on my end, but I had my mom's support to do that. So she helped me out with some of my expenses while I went back to school. And then I racked up the rest of it in debt, obviously. And so these are the experiences that I want folks to talk about, because I'm not saying one route is better than the other. I'm saying you have to know all of the information to make the best decision for you.
Yep. I say that all the time to my staff, to like my kid, right? All the time. He's about to be 9. And I think about this often when I think about like the values ideology versus the values practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think about it in the space that it shows up to the most, which is like being a parent, where it's like I feel these things, right? And like I have a very strong disposition towards a certain ideology, but then when I have to practice these things as somebody who is responsible for another human, am I making the same decisions, right? Like, is it good enough in that space? And I think about that often when I think about how, like, you know, my kid's still 8, right? But 10 years from now, are we going to have a conversation about college? And am I going to give my kid the same speech, right? Am I going to say to my kid, like, I didn't finish college, right? And this is where I'm at, but here are all the things that I went through, right? And also, like, you could go to college, and let's weigh out your options. You know, I don't feel like he has to go to college, right? Like, right. I'm just like, you don't have to do that if you don't want to do that. You can go into a trade. You can take the longer route. But at the end of the day, to me, it's just like a real choice is only available if you have all of the information. Mm-hmm. That's what I like to think, right?
I completely agree.
If you have all the information, then it's a real choice. If you don't have all the information, then it's a false choice.
Right.
Right. And to me, I think about that, like, how am I going to provide this way out for my own kid when the day comes, and respect the decision that they make, right? And respect, like, yeah, he might say, like, well, I'm going to go to college. I'm going to rack up at 10 years from now. God knows how much it's going to cost to go to college, right? But, like, or not. And how am I going to show up, and how am I going to be supportive either way?
It's interesting because one of the things that you and I have talked about is the capacity building with the anti-racist lens. And for me, going back to that, I mentioned to you that we have our leadership pipeline. You're about to partner with us on that. Yeah. But the main reason creating that type of space was really important to me was because how many times do decisions trickle down in nonprofits and folks don't know what it means for them? And so, like, I like to share financial statements. I share salaries. I share logic. We had a steering committee for a strategic plan so that it wasn't just executive team making decisions. Like, I try to involve folks in all pieces of it because I'm like, when I'm telling you something, I want you to have all of the pieces. I want you to know how to read a 990 if you're going for another job. And so I think oftentimes we do folks a disservice by not sharing all of that because we're trying to protect ourselves and we don't know how it's going to land. But I was like, I need you to know all of that. just so that you can make an informed decision here. You may not want to work here by the time I'm done sharing all this information, but at least you made an informed decision about what's good for you.
Yeah, it's really hard. I think that's one of the things about leadership that feels really difficult to me, is like not the sharing part, but like not feeling a responsibility for how people take it and decide what they want to do with it, right? That to me is the scary part. Growing up, I was the kid, my dad talks about this all the time. When I had my son, he was like, I hope he does to you what you did to me, right? I was the kid who asked why for everything.
Like, I think that's an eldest child thing, because I was the same way.
Yeah? Yeah, my dad would say, like, I would ask a question, like, why is the sky this, blue? And he'd be like, because whatever. And I'd be like, why? Or, like, I would see, he points out, like, I would point out, like, unhomed people under the viaduct. And I'd be like, why are they there? And he'd like, explain it to me, and I'd be like, why? And eventually, I would ask why so many times that he'd be like, hey, ángela, it just is, right? And so I'm still that person, right? I ask why for everything. Like, I want to know, right? Again, back to the informed decision making. Like, I want to ask all my questions so that I feel like I have the information that I need to make the decisions that I want to make. And I try to have that same disposition with the staff, right? When we bring somebody on board, I do a whole, like, 1 hour session with them about, like, how did this happen? How did we get here? Where does our money come from? Why are we doing anti-racism? What does that mean to us, right? Because anti-racism could mean something different to anybody that you ask. But what is our frame specifically? What does that look like in practice? What is the vision? What's the strategic direction that we're going in? Like, was the board mad? Like all the things. I try to go through that with folks because I want them to understand, like, why we're here. Like, why are we here? Why are we doing the things that we're doing? And are you down, essentially? Right. Like, are you down with this? And I try, we're growing, right? And so I would love, even just your thoughts around this, but like, we're growing, and we went from like 2 people to like 3 people, and then all of us within a year, this year. And then now we're like about to be 7 people, right? And to me, it's just like, now how do I manage that same culture with like more growing and growing and growing and growing, right? It's just like, how do I continue to like share all the information? What information do I share? What's applicable? What's not applicable, right? What's HR? Like all the what's sensitive, right? Like all the things, because I still want to keep that culture. And as an ED, sometimes I feel burdened by not making the wrong decision. Like by being like, well, am I supposed to, right? And even then having to question myself on like, well, supposed to by whose standards, right? Right.
And being able to challenge that, because especially if you've been in this work for so long, you've had that pushed on you for so long. I have to consistently check myself and surround myself with folks that are willing to argue and push back and stuff like that in case I'm wrong. Yeah. I don't think I'm ever wrong, but that's a whole other story.
The oldest child syndrome again.
Right. That's coming out strong, right? I have 2 younger brothers. So, and for us, it's going from 55 employees to about 160.
Wow.
And so we're really struggling with being able to keep that same level of transparency, because information doesn't spread the same way that it did at 55. No. It just did not. I don't know everybody's name anymore. I'm terrible with names on a good day.
No, that's a big staff. I mean, that's a lot of pressure. It's like there's one you, right? So everyone's going to know who you are, but then like 150.
Everybody does not know who I am, and I've learned that because I used to assume that, which is a little egocentric, I think now in hindsight. So now I introduce myself.
They're like, what department do you work in?
Yeah, I literally get that question. They're like, so what's your role at Alternatives? I was like, so one of my development director was actually bringing up today, because we do like series, like webinars on topics. Like we did one on student loan forgiveness. We have one on home buyership, because one of our goals is the idea of closing the wealth gap. And she was like, we should have one on how to interview and like the research you do beforehand, because I literally have folks come on board and be like, so what is your role? And I'm like, so I'm the executive director. And they're like, oh, okay, tell me about that.
That's funny. That's kind of humbling though, isn't it?
It's good, right? Like they're asking. And so like, but yeah, that's why I said it's a little egocentric for me to assume.
I mean, it's not it's not a far-fetched expectation.
But it's taught me a little about assumptions,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, at the very least.
Right. And so like I like now make it a point, but it's also really funny when people don't realize and they start having one employee talked about interviewing with me and like he basically told me I was bougie because my dream car would be a Jaguar. And then afterwards was telling other folks like I didn't know that was the ED. Like, had I known, I would have had a completely different conversation. And so for me, I'm like, it's fun when people don't realize it because they're. I don't lead with Bessie the ED. I'm just like showing up as me.
Yeah.
You're looking at the ED title when you see me, and I forget that. With
Yeah,
folks.
that's hard.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard. And I think that is part of like bringing it back to the anti-racism, right? I think it's like in all the roles, right? But specifically when you're the ED, right? It's like having to own privilege and power. To me, that's step one, right? It's just like I'm the ED, so I have to be really thoughtful around like how I interact with folks and also my expectations because there's already this like the ED, you know, and you don't necessarily want that, right? It's just like you don't have to change your answer because I'm the ED versus like I'm your colleague. Right? I mean, I'm your colleague, right? I'm still your colleague. It's just different, right? And so I think like for us, like when we're talking about anti-racism, like for me, it's just like it's a lot of work to constantly have to be thinking about like how am I showing up? What are the things that I'm saying? You know, what are the things that I'm doing? Like, not just the things that I'm saying, but what are the things that I'm doing and how am I making sure that I'm not upholding the very things that we talk about not wanting to uphold, right? So everything from like the way that I show up and dress, right? How I interact with staff. Am I making sure that like I'm not sitting in my office all day with the door closed, right? Do my conversations with staff look the same as they do with like my board members?
Right.
You know, and like with funders and with other and community partners that come into play, right? Like, I think it's really important to do that. Like when sometimes I'm sending emails in the middle of the night and I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to send this. I'm going to just schedule it to go out first thing in the morning.
I'm terrible at that, but
I'm
I
really
usually only do it with the E-team. I try not to do it with anybody else.
Yeah, me too. But even then, I'm just like.
My E-team's fine ignoring me.
So sometimes I'm like, well, like if you send me an email at 10 o'clock at night, like that's you, right? But then what I have to remember is that like that's a privilege. You know, it's a privilege because I'm not going to look at them and say like, oh, well, I have to respond because because you're in your role, right? But they might do that to me.
I think what's hard too is like acknowledging privilege and also dealing with your own baggage that comes with being a person of color. So I was thinking quite a bit about our conversation around the right to rest and wellness that we had, right? Because after I got off with you, I was doing my like doom scrolling on Instagram and there was this
I love a good doom scroll.
And there was this little meme that popped up that was like, my ancestors didn't immigrate for us to be some broke bitches. And like, it was really funny the way that's worded, but I think there's something about that because in my background, what I was going to bring up is my mom is a housekeeper. And so it's hard for me. Like, I remember with site visits, every rich white person reminded me of my mom's boss. And my mom would take me with her to work and be like, don't say anything, don't move, like sit there, read your book, and like don't touch anything, right?
Yeah.
And so like when I would get in front of these funders, my boss would be like, why aren't you saying anything? I'm like, that's what I've been taught my whole life, right? Or else my mom would lose her job. And so, like, thinking about, like, how hard my parents worked to get me to where I was, it took me a long time to be able to be like, yes, but, you know, I can take a vacation. I can take rest. I don't have to work the long hours that my mom does to get me there. And so, like, what is ingrained in us, not just from a rest perspective, but, like, the baggage that we bring in. So we're wrestling with our own identities that are marginalized while also acknowledging privilege, right? Like, and trying to reconcile the two.
Yeah, it's hard. It's so hard. I mean, our staff, we're a small staff, right? But we're all people of color. And right now, all women identifying, right? And so there's even just that alone, right? Like there's work and labor that women do often, right? And so there's a lot of baggage behind that. And we do 2 wellness weeks. I think I was telling you this the other day. We do 2 wellness weeks a year for staff. And at this last one, we came back and we do like staff check-ins on Mondays. And the question was like, how did you, before we left, it was like, what are you going to do for yourself, over your wellness week? And when we came back, it was like, okay, did you do the thing, right? And we ended up getting into a conversation because folks were like, I had a really hard time unplugging or letting go because I left all these like looming emails and like to-do lists that didn't get completed. And so like I spent a lot of my time thinking about that, right? And I was like, well, I was just like, okay, well, it's going to happen when it happens. Like, I'm just taking my week, right?
That's your Gemini sign right there.
It's true. I'm like, there's always going to be work, guys. It's always going to be work, right? And I mean, and I say that sometimes just like to be funny, right? Like, I feel like, 30% of my job is to just like make people laugh.
My E-team tried to tell me I was not funny. I'm still offended by that.
Oh no, I would be so sad if they told me that. But I was trying to be funny, but at the same time, I was like, listen, like, we don't need to earn this. Like, and this is me using my privilege, right, as the ED. Like, I'm the person that's telling you, like, you do not need to earn this rest. And for me, it's really important. Similarly, like, I grew up with working class parents, and we didn't have shit. We didn't have anything. Like, I remember parts of my life where we were like, I was like, damn, we 100% like made powdered milk. Like, and thinking about this as an adult, right? Thinking back to my childhood and being like, damn, we made powdered milk. Like, that's crazy. We must have been like poor, right? Like, powdered milk, I still can taste it. I feel traumatized by the idea of it. And, I have kids now. And so, like, when I think about, like, wellness and I think about, like, the types of things that I want to do, and even, like, early on, like, in my career, like, I've been doing this work for so long, but there were moments in time where, like, I was only working part-time, and then part-time, I was doing housekeeping. Right? And me, born here, like, the whole thing I was talking about, well-spoken, all this other shit, right? I was going to people's houses in Indiana and cleaning these, like, mini mansions. And that was a really humbling experience for me, right? And so when I think about wellness, I think about all the things that we go through, and also, like, the onus on us to, like, do that personal work,
Yeah.
So that we're not showing up with that and having those expectations reflected on the people that, like, we serve. And when I say I serve, I mean my staff, right? Like, they're my staff technically, but, like, ultimately, like, I serve you.
Right.
Like, I got to do the things that I got to do to make sure that you can do the things you want to do.
Yeah.
And, I'm the person that's, like, texting my staff when they're supposed to be on a day off and I see emails coming from them, and I'm like, stop emailing me. I'm going to disable
Oh,
you.
I send those emails out too.
I don't, right? I'm just like...
No, I'm literally like, stop. Why are you working right now? I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, stop. I'm going to disable your email. Like, stop it. And that's literally a text that I've sent before. I'm going to disable your email, right? When my associate director, she went on paternal leave.
We had to do that to somebody. I just thought about it. Yeah, we did.
When Anna went on paternal leave, on parental leave rather, she was like, okay, I'm logging off of my email. And I was like, okay, great. And then I changed her password. And I didn't tell anybody. And I was like, I'm changing your password. Because I want to be very clear here that, like, you're on break and you don't need to be worried about us. Like, we want you to rest. We want you to, like, enjoy your time off. Like, you are not, we don't have the expectation that you're going to be here, right? Take your time. And so I changed her password, and I think she texted me and was like, did you change my password? And I'm like, how do you know? How do you know? But to me, it's just like having to say, like, listen, like, we, especially in the last 3 years, it's like there's a lot of stuff happening in the world for people that look like us. And whether it's something that is directly happening to us, doesn't matter. We feel it. Like, we feel it. Like, there's a level of ownership. There's a heaviness that comes with it. And we have to acknowledge that. And we have to acknowledge that, like, it weighs on us as human beings. And we need to be able to give ourselves the space to, like, think and cry and breathe and sleep and, do all of the things in order to, like, be the people that we want to be, ultimately. Like, I don't know, maybe it's a little fluffy, but I'm just like, I've seen this meme, speaking of that, right? It's like the whole, like, take your time because if you die tomorrow, they're going to replace you. But it's like, it's true.
It is.
It's true.
I had an employee collapse in the workplace some years ago. And I had to sit her down, and I was like, yo, because it turned out to just be, we took her to the hospital, it turned out to just be stress. And I was like, dude, I need you to understand that if you can't come to work anymore, I will hire somebody else.
It's true, though.
But who's going to replace you at home? And, like, she's like, I've never had a supervisor say that to me. And I was like, dude, you need to take care of yourself. Like, that is the thing. These are just jobs. You can get another one.
It's not that serious.
I think so many people take the work so personally, but there's so many organizations doing great work that, like, you can find a fit for you. You don't have to sit here and jeopardize your health for you.
Well, and it's also like the idea that, like, you can care about the work, right? Like, I care deeply.
Mm-hmm.
I care deeply about the work, but I also care about myself, right? And I'm not a martyr to the work. I used to be, right?
But you're not effective at the work if you're not taking care of yourself.
Exactly. And that was, I'm not going to act like that's like a key that I've always had, right? Like, I think and many times I've been the person that's like overworked myself and been stressed and like done and been a martyr to the cause. Right?
Oh, I'm sure my assistant who's in the room right now is side-eyeing me because she had to clear out my calendar to force me to take a vacation. But like, you need those folks around
you. Need those folks, right? And ultimately, it's just like we're not always going to be good at it, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not always good at it,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But it's like, are we building a culture around each other that values this thing so that we can hold ourselves accountable to it? Right? This year, my birthday passed, right? And I wasn't going to take the day off. I didn't say anything to anybody about it being my birthday or anything. I was just like, I'm not going to take the day off, whatever. And so it was on a Monday. We usually do internal meetings on Monday. And then like, somebody was like, oh, I'm going to cancel these meetings because it's her birthday. And I was like, I'm not taking the day off. And everyone else was just like, yes, you are. It's your birthday. Like, what are you going to do? And I was like, show up to work like I do every other day, right? And they all canceled their meetings with me. So even if I wasn't going to, like, take the day off, they all, on their part, canceled on me. And I was like, well, fuck, I guess I got to take the day off now. And, I wasn't going to, but then I was like, you know what? I'm glad I did. And I'm glad that they forced me to do that. And I'm glad that we have the kind of culture and that we have, like, gotten to a place that amongst ourselves, like, we are valuing rest, we're valuing like off time, we're valuing like celebration and joy, because I think those are acts of resistance as well. Like, we always have so much shit that's like bringing us down, like to pull up the things that bring us joy, I think are important. Birthdays usually do that, right? And so like for me, it's just like we are building a culture where folks are saying, you need to take the day off. Hey, ED.
Right.
Take the day off. Like,
right.
It's your birthday. We'll see you tomorrow, right? And those are the moments where I'm like, all right, yeah, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Let me go get a massage. And that's what I did.
Yeah, no, I definitely have, I think, a team that does that, which is great because I am also not always good at it. But believe it or not, we are at time.
Oh, my goodness.
So are there any final words or takeaways that you want to leave folks with?
Well, now I feel like I got to sing, but...
Everybody is not Xavier.
No, I mean, I think that, like, any final words? I feel like, I think it's important to, as people of color, right? And I say this as, like, an ED, right? As a founding ED at that, right? I think that, like, there's always, fortunately or unfortunately, there's always going to be work to do. There's always going to be shit. There's always going to be something that we're like fighting for, against, with. And I think that like, and that's sometimes sad, but it's a beautiful thing. To me, it brings camaraderie. To me, it brings like allyship. To me, it shows like, ultimately at the depth and at the core, like our commitment to each other as humans. And at the same time, I think that it's really important for us to like start with us, right? To take that time, to take that day off, to find joy, to put ourselves above, to show up authentically, right? I think those are the radical changes that like they're not the most like impactful, and I say that in quotes, right? Because it doesn't necessarily do things for other people, but like what as marginalized people, when we show up as our true selves, like what is it actually saying? Like what are the shifts that are happening even if we don't see them in real time? And I feel very privileged to be able to be now in a space and in a point in my life where I feel like I have that. I don't know what kind of impact it's going to make ultimately, right? But for me, at the very least, like, for me, it does. And I feel like that's good enough. So thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here with you and to have a conversation.
Where can folks find you online?
Oh my God, they can't. We just had this conversation.
Or AMPT. Can find AMPT. So promote AMPT. So the conversation we had for folks is that she's a lurker, and that's it.
Yeah, that's it.
So am I, so
boundaries,
I can't judge.
Boundaries. I am not for consumption. You can find us at our website is www.ampchicago.org, or our Instagram handle AmpChicago, Twitter AmpChicago, or we don't do Twitter anymore, actually. X. No, we don't do that.
Oh,
either. We're just off. What's the new one? I don't know.
Threads?
Yeah, I think we're on that now. Shout out to Anna, my associate director.
I have no idea anything about it yet.
Me neither. All these things that I'm saying, I don't know anything about, but my team would be upset if I didn't say that. So we're on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, all AMP Chicago.
All right. Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you.